Hello everyone! In today's demo, I'm going to go over something a bit different. I want to discuss changing your medium to better suit your needs. This demo is going to be about breaking out of your comfort zone and keeping an open mind when approaching a project. So today I'm going to be creating some little spot illustrations in watercolor. These watercolors are a Daniel Smith brand. This is actually Justin's palette that I snatched right off his desk while he wasn't looking. I'm using Arch's hot press watercolor paper that comes on a block, which is great because it keeps the paper from buckling. And I'm using 3 Kolinsky sable brushes in size 00, 1, and 4. The theme for my illustrations today are nesting sites for my little Draco Florist dragons. So first, I'm going to just lightly make some marks as guidelines for where I want things to be placed. I'm using my brown color erase pencil. The nest is going to have 2 eggs, so I want to map out where those are going to be. I'm not sure about each of these pigments, so this is going to be an experiment. I am primarily an oil painter. It's definitely my medium of choice, and it's my favorite paint to work with. But sometimes for a project, you need to look beyond the scope of what you're comfortable with and really see different mediums as a tool. There are some instances where your medium of choice may not actually be the best one to accomplish the project you're working on. It's about breaking out of your comfort zone. I dipped my largest brush, the size 4, into a glass of water, and now I'm blotting some grayish-green pigment onto the paper. This is going to be a very interesting demo because watercolor is a medium that I have not worked in probably about 10 years or more. So I'm not going to think too much about it, and I'm just going to go and have fun. I'm approaching this in a similar manner as I do with oils, starting with the largest brush and working in large shapes, and then working down to my smaller brushes for the sharper details. The more water I add to my brush, the thinner and lighter the pigment appears. I can layer my paint and add less water to get darker shadows. I wanted to map out the eggs first in pencil because that is the only element of the piece that really needs to have a defined shape. For the foliage, I can be really loose with my brushwork. I'm not going to use too many pigments from this palette, but the light green seems like a nice color to use for the brighter foliage. You can see how I'm starting with a lot of water and layering my pigments to achieve dimension. The reason I decided to try watercolors is because I'm currently working on a project that requires many small spot illustrations that accompany text. My first thought was to just use ink or pencil, but some of the illustrations needed to have color to help support the narrative of the story. So I was thinking that I could just do them all in oil. I actually ordered a bunch of little panels so I could start, but after some thought, it seemed like oils would not be the right answer for this particular project. Time-wise, I did not want to have to prep that many panels, and glazing would be difficult since I want the illustrations to have a white background so they can be overlaid onto the pages in between paragraphs of text. I thought that maybe I could do the oil paintings like I usually do, starting with a black panel and layering my paint, and then just cut out the shapes I would need to put onto the pages. But after some thought, it just seemed like that would be so many extra steps. So now I'm going to switch my brush to the smaller size 1 Kolinsky sable to get some tighter details. This piece has been using all greens up until this point, so I'm going to mix in a little raw umber to help balance things out. When painting in oil, I love to layer foliage. I think I'm going to do the same thing here with watercolor. I'll just keep painting in these tiny leaves, layering them one on top of another until I have a nice dense little collection of foliage. If you add a lot of pigment and water to your brush, you'll notice that as the paint dries, the pigment settles into the borders of the shape you painted, which gives you a nice little gradient fill. You can see that here in some of these leaves. Another reason I decided to use watercolor for these studies is that I can get a whole bunch of them painted in a single day. It's also much easier to paint outdoors in case I want to do some filled illustrations. And I like that they're small and light and won't compete with the full-page oil paintings that will also be in the book. These are going to be really small when they're printed, maybe only 1 to 2 inches tall. I cannot imagine having to isolate all of these little stems and branches if I would have tried doing this in oils. So I'm going to introduce some Hansa yellow flowers onto the tips of these stems. This is a nice little accent color. I still haven't decided on what color to make the eggs just yet. But since I added these bright yellow flowers, I'll probably just make them something cool-toned to match the foliage. Maybe a soft blue or a light grayish green. I usually don't like to incorporate too many bright colors into a piece. I like to use a lot of neutral tones like browns and greens and grays, and then maybe have one strong accent color. I'm going to add some more raw umber to the nest interior to warm up the shadows. The pigment I put down before is already dry, so thankfully things aren't getting too muddy. There's one pigment in this palette that is not watercolor. There's a white gouache right at the top of the palette, and I can use that to paint some of my highlights back in. It tends to sink down to more of a gray tone when it dries, but it's a nice way to get some subtle highlighting. I want the nest to have some lichen incorporated into the weeds and branches. There is a beautiful teal here that I think I'm going to use for these eggs. I don't have too much pigment on my brush. I just want to stain the paper with the pigment. I'm glad I warmed up the shadows behind them with that raw umber. The blue stands out a bit more strongly now. So I'm going to add another detail pass and really focus on painting in these extra little weeds and strands and stray grass blades. Even though this is a different medium, I still want to add the same types of details as I would if this were an oil painting, just so people know it's from the same artist. Around the edges of the piece, I'm going to dab in some watery shapes to give the illusion of atmospheric perspective. I want to just hint at the fact that there are more plants without actually detailing them. I'm also going to dab in some of my darker teal onto the nest itself to help round out the shape of the nest. I can paint my lichen back onto the top of the area that I just shadowed. And so this is my first little spot illustration. I did record another one just for fun. I'm going to speed through that one just so you can see some of the process. I painted it in the same way as the one you just saw, except this one has larger leaves that got a little more attention than the leaves in the last piece, but you get the basic idea. I will say that I really love painting foliage in watercolor. It's nice to just load your brush up with water and pigment and see what shapes will appear as the paint dries. It's much different than working in oil, but as I mentioned in the beginning of this demo, sometimes there are mediums that just work better for certain types of projects. Honestly, deciding to go this route for this part of the book is something I've been fighting with for a few months now. I wanted to include little spot illustrations to help support the narrative of my text without competing with the full oil paintings. I had been using graphite drawings as placeholders, but in the end it seemed like watercolor would actually work best for what I had in mind for the project, so I'm really glad I gave it a try. So I guess the lesson is, don't be afraid to experiment and try out new mediums. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this demo. If you have any questions about this video or ideas for new videos, please let me know in the comments below. As always, your support means the world to me, and I just want to be sure that I'm making the type of content that you feel would be the most helpful for you. Until next time, bye.